I couldn't talk at all. Wasn't sure what we were going to do, but thankfully my voice has kicked in here a little bit, so just bear with me. I also want to address a rumor that's been going around for the last hour or two that Jamie and I are expecting twins. I didn't know either, so you can imagine. No, that's not true. I did know, but we are expecting twins. That being said, I'm looking for some revivals this fall, just try to make a little extra money. So if you know anybody that's looking, I'll be available. A couple weeks ago, somebody sent me an article that attempted to rank the top 30 movie endings of all time. A group of film critics got together and they voted on what they thought was best. And on the list, they had such classics as Citizen Kane, Planet of the Apes, Casablanca, The Shawshank Redemption, and so on. Many movies that you have seen or at least would recognize the titles. Now you know that ranking something as subjective as a movie ending is nearly impossible. What I think might be a great ending, you might think is dumb, and vice versa. But it did get me thinking, how do you rank it? When it comes to movie endings, what are you looking for? So I started to do a little research. I discovered that film critics will tell you that there are really only 5 ways to end a movie. Now, there's millions of different ways to get to the ending, but there's really only 5 different ways. So number 1 on the list are what we call happy endings. They call them triumphs. This is where, all the questions are answered. The character achieves their goal. Everything turns out great and everybody goes home happy. Then there are what they call tragedies, in which the main character winds up worse off than when they started. Then there are what's known as unresolved endings. We would call them cliffhangers. You come to the end of the movie, there's some question that's left hanging out there, and it's up to you to sort of finish in your mind. Then they have what are called classic tragedies and comedic tragedies. This is where the main character achieves their goal, but they lose something more important in the process. So they get the job, but they lose their family. Or the detective solves the case, but in the middle of all that, he does something that causes him to lose his job. So I was thinking about this, and I asked myself this question: which of those types of endings do you enjoy most? Now, if you're like me, you probably enjoy happy endings. We tend to like movies where everything comes out like we hope. So your favorite team wins the game, the detective solves the case, the couple falls in love and lives happily ever after, the good guys beat the bad guys. You know how it goes. But in real life, we know that happy endings can sometimes be elusive. Happy endings can sometimes be hard to come by. Your team doesn't always win. The couple doesn't always live happily ever after. The detective does not always solve the case. And the good guys don't always win the battle. In real life, happy endings can be hard to come by. So if you have your Bible or your phone with you, I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This morning we're continuing our series that we've been in that we've called The Comeback. Now over the last few weeks, we've gone with this theme that every setback is really a setup for a comeback, but there's one question that I've been asked repeatedly, and maybe you've thought about this, and I know it's an uncomfortable question, but it is a reality for a lot of us, and here's the question: what do you do when it feels like a comeback is impossible? What do you do when you're caught in some situation that seems irreversible? How do you come back when you've lost your job, you've failed a class, you've had a miscarriage, or somebody you love has died? What do you do when it doesn't look like your story is going to have the happy ending that you envision? You look into the future and there's some circumstance that's unchangeable, and the future you see does not look anything like the future that you once envisioned. So what do you do? Well, a lot of people, they get angry, they look for somebody to blame, maybe they start to self-medicate to numb the pain, drugs and alcohol or whatever. And what sometimes ends up happening, we have all these ways that we try to resolve the tension that's building in our lives, but instead of resolving that tension, we add more to it by some of the ways we try to deal with it. So what do you do when a comeback is impossible? The book of 2 Corinthians is a letter written by a guy named Paul. He wrote 13 of the 27 books that make up the New Testament, but 2 Corinthians is by far the most personal thing that he ever wrote. Years earlier, Paul had been on one of these missionary trips. He'd helped to start this little church in Corinth, but now some time has gone by. Paul's traveled to other parts of the world, and in his absence, these false teachers have shown up, and they've tried to take control of this little church. And one of the ways they've tried to do that is by discrediting Paul in the eyes of the people. And the way they've done this is through character assassination. They've done everything they can to try and make Paul look bad. And since Paul's not there to defend himself, in chapter 11, you get to this point where he reminds the people of everything he's gone through. He's trying to set the record straight. So he goes through and he lists for them everything that he's endured on their behalf. He's been in prison. He's been flogged. He's been beaten with rods. He's been stoned. He's been shipwrecked. He's been attacked by robbers. He's been attacked by religious leaders. He's been hungry and thirsty and in prison. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And if anything, Paul's life has been one challenge after another. There's not been an easy moment in his entire life. If you're following along on your outline, there's a truth there that I don't want you to miss, and it's this. The presence of adversity does not equal the absence of God. Make sure you understand that the presence of adversity does not equal the absence of God. A lot of times when something goes wrong, we assume that God has forsaken us, and we've convinced ourselves that if God was real, if God was paying attention, then nothing bad would ever happen to us, but that's not how it works. In fact, that's never been how it works. If you were to go back in history, it would be nearly impossible to find someone who was closer to God than the Apostle Paul. And yet, throughout his entire life, he's faced all these incredible challenges, and he's experienced some pretty deep hurts. When you get to chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, he goes into some detail about one particular hurt that he's experienced and continues to experience. Now, to set this up for you so that it makes sense, you have to understand that one of the criticisms these guys lobbed at Paul was that he did not have these visions like they had. They were all the time talking about these incredible visions that God had given them. And since Paul never talked about those things, they used that as a way of saying, well, he's not as spiritual as we are, or he'd have had some of these visions. So as chapter 12 begins, Paul uncharacteristically acknowledges that God has allowed him to have this incredible spiritual experience. In fact, it's been so incredible that God told him not to talk about it with anybody. So he's had this incredible vision, and he's not supposed to talk about it, and yet if he doesn't talk about it, his opponents are going to use that as a means of trying to discredit him. So in the first part of chapter 12, he attempts to walk this tightrope between saying too much and not saying enough. It's interesting how he does this. Check this out with me. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 1. Paul says, I must go on boasting, although there's nothing to be gained. I'll go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. So again, it's hard to explain, but apparently 14 years earlier, Paul's had this moment where God ushers him into heaven, into paradise, gives him this vision of what heaven's going to be like, and then tells him he's not allowed to talk about it, which was just as well, because if you remember from our heaven series earlier this year, you couldn't describe it anyways. Words couldn't do it justice. So that's the cool part of the story. Then you get down to verse 6, and the story takes a dramatic turn. Check this out. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. Or because of these surpassingly great revelations, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Now, a few months ago, one afternoon, I went up to Save-A-Lot to get something to drink. Now, if you've ever been to Save-A-Lot, you know there are times it gets really busy, lines are backed up, there's just people everywhere, and that was the case. So I was standing there in line, and I had my drink, whatever it was, and there was 4 or 5 people deep in line, and there was an older lady in front of me that had a cart full of groceries. And I knew it was going to be a while, so I'm standing. Well, she turns around, and she smiles at me. So I, smiled back, and then she turned back around. Then she turned around again. She smiled at me a second time. And I smiled, and this went on. So finally we got to like 5 times. She had turned around and smiled at me, and I was smiling back. But at that point, it's getting awkward. You know what I mean? It's like, how you doing? Good. How you doing? Good. All right, good. So then she turns around, and about the 6th time, she says, are you the preacher at First Christian? Now, that can be kind of a loaded question sometimes. So I was trying to think, do I know this lady? And I hesitated, and I said, yes, I am. And then she turned back around. Then she turned again the 7th time, and she smiled. She said, my husband and I watch you every weekend online. I thought, oh, good, thank goodness. So I thanked her for watching. Then she turns around, and she pulls out this envelope, this blank envelope, and she hands it to me, and she said, would you mind signing something for my husband? Now, I kind of had the reaction you did. I kind of laughed, and I said, well, ma'am, it's not going to be worth anything, but if you want me to, write a little note. So I wrote a little note, and, thanks for watching, all that stuff. And then I got right to the end of the little note, and you know what I did? I signed my name big and bold, just like if you were, giving an autograph, you played for the Reds or something. And I'm telling you, I came back to church. Jennifer had to open both doors for me to get back in. I mean, my head was out here. In fact, in the last few weeks, I had some tough days. I go to Save-A-Lot and hang out, just walk up and down the aisles, just hoping that this lady is going to come back through. But here's Paul, and unlike me, he's a legitimate, rock star. Here's this guy. He's playing in churches. He's trained leaders. He's traveled the world. He's written all these incredible letters. He's even visited heaven. I mean, here's this guy. If anybody was going to be conceited, it would be this guy. So in order to keep that from happening, he was given what he calls a thorn in the flesh. And one of the things that's interesting about this is the Bible never actually identifies what it was. Because of that, there's been a lot of speculation. Some people say it was something physical. You hear people say that Paul had a degenerative eye disease and made it hard to see. You hear other people say he had migraines or epilepsy or some form of tuberculosis. There's some evidence that maybe he had a speech impediment, some of the things he wrote. Or it might not have been anything physical at all. Could have been depression. Maybe there was some ongoing temptation. Maybe all of the beatings and all their rest and everything he'd been through sort of added up. Maybe he had some emotional problems, some struggles with anxiety. Maybe it was family issues. I mean, there's no way to know exactly what it was that Paul was struggling with, but I think he does that intentionally. I think Paul worded this in a way so that you and I could sort of fill in the blank on whatever it is that bothers us. Now, if Paul had said, I suffered from a degenerative eye disease, you might not have been able to relate to that. Or if he just said, I battled with depression, that may not be your issue. But you have an issue. And by calling it a thorn in the flesh, he leaves it open-ended enough for all of us to sort of write in whatever it is that bothers us. We all have something. There's a challenge. There's an addiction. There's a habit. There's some situation, some event that we wish we could go back and change. There's something we've done that we wish we hadn't have done. There's something we didn't do that we wish we had have done, and there's no way to go back and change it now. And Paul leaves it open-ended enough for you and I to put in whatever it is for us. He calls it a thorn in the flesh. A thorn is something sharp, something that causes a lot of pain. And Paul said that even though he'd been to heaven, even though he'd done all these other things, there was still something in his life that was causing him pain. In fact, he says it torments him. And the Greek word for torment is a word that literally means a clenched fist that keeps on hitting you. So every day when Paul gets up, there's that fist. And every night when he goes to lay down, there's that fist that just keeps punching him right in the face. And whatever it was, we know for sure it was painful, it was in some ways debilitating, and it was constant. Now here's my question for you. If you had to fill in the blank and identify what it is that keeps punching you in the face, what would it be? Depression, anxiety, grief, family problems, cancer, a debt you'll never be able to pay off, an abusive relationship, problems with your kids, health challenges, some sort of disease. I mean, it could be anything, but we all have one. We all have something that we wish we could change that is essentially unchangeable. So whenever you hear us talk about a comeback, you think, okay, that sounds great, but you keep reminding yourself that in your situation, a comeback is impossible. So what do you do? 2 Corinthians chapter 12, you see four things in the example of Paul. Here's the first one. You learn to endure patiently. In our world, we've somehow convinced ourselves that adversity means that God is absent. But what you discover when you read the Bible is the opposite of that. Instead of being an indication that God has somehow abandoned you, challenges are actually an indication that God is up to something in your life. Look at some of these verses with me. Colossians 1, verse 11. Here's what Paul prays. Be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience. Get to Romans 5. Here's what he says. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. You get to James, the half-brother of Jesus, in James chapter 1 writes this. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Then you get down to verse 12 of James 1. Here's what he says. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love. Now, most of us go through life and we're convinced, and we convince ourselves that suffering is something to be avoided. And yet, if you believe what the Bible says, from God's perspective, suffering is something that's to be embraced because it leads to growth. Paul understood. That's why in verse 7 he says he was given this thorn in the flesh. In the Greek, that's a purpose statement. It's the same phrase you would use to describe being given a gift on Christmas morning. It's not a curse, it's a gift. Now, most of the time you think about a gift, you think about something fun, a new outfit, a new video game, a beach vacation, a new car. But because of that, we forget that gifts sometimes come disguised as problems. That's why they go unrecognized. But if you know people and you talk to people that have been through some painful circumstances, a lot of times they'll tell you that what they went through, even though it was not fun and even though it was hard, turned out to be a gift. So you think about it like this. Could a DUI conviction be a gift? It is if it causes you to address a problem before it's too late. Could losing your job be a gift? It could if it causes you to discover your true calling. Could cancer be a gift? It is if it causes you to have deeper relationships and conversations with the people you love. Is it possible that your life completely caving in around you could be a gift? It is if it causes you to develop a relationship with Jesus. So here's the deal. I know we don't like to admit this, but a lot of times the things that we're most trying to get rid of are the things that God is using to turn us into the people that he wants us to be. So rather than getting angry and upset and bitter, it's important for us to learn to endure patiently until we see what God is up to. Here's the second thing. You endure patiently. You also pray fervently. Check out what he says in verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Now, Paul was just like us. Something goes wrong in your life, what do? You pray. It's just a natural response. So Paul says here, 3 times I prayed. I pleaded with God to remove this thing from my life. But don't let that fool you, because you read that and you think, well, 3 times is not that many. You've got stuff in your life that you've prayed about way more times than 3. But the way this is written in Greek, it's an idiom that actually represents 3 distinct periods of Paul's life. So this was not like Paul prayed for this thing, 3 times and that was it. He prayed for this thing thousands of times. But there were 3 distinct periods in his life when he went to God and he said, God, I can't go on like this. You have to do something. You have to take this thing away. You ever prayed a prayer like that? I have. And here's Paul, and he goes to God. And what makes this so incredible is that God's answer to Paul's prayer is no. Now, there's a popular branch of Christianity in our world that says if you just pray with enough faith that God will give you anything you want. That's not true. It's never been true. You could make a case that Paul had more faith than anybody in history. He had more faith than all of us put together. And yet when he goes to God and he asks that this painful thing be removed from his life, God says no. So does that mean you shouldn't pray? No. It just means that when you pray, You need to be prepared for God to answer however he wants to answer. Somebody said there are actually 3 ways that God answers prayer. Sometimes he says yes, sometimes he says no, and sometimes he says wait. And for Paul, the answer here was no. But even though the answer was no, he made Paul a promise that was better than removing the thorn in the flesh. Check out verse 9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. It's an incredible statement. What he literally says is that God's power reaches its full measure at our weakest points. Keep in mind, this is not the answer Paul was looking for. This is not the happy ending he was hoping for. He was still hoping that God would choose to remove this thing from his life. But rather than removing it, God used it to demonstrate his power through Paul's weakness. So he makes Paul this promise, my grace will be sufficient for you. That's what we call God's sustaining grace. God doesn't want to just use his grace to save you. He uses his grace to sustain you day by day through all the challenges of life. And when Paul came to understand it, it was an incredible moment in his life. That's why what he wrote next is so powerful. Verse 10, that is why for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. Here's a third thing you see in this story. You worship passionately. Here's a guy who had every reason to be disappointed with God. He'd given his life to serving God, to helping people connect with God. He endured more than most of us can imagine. And then when he goes to God and he asks God to remove this painful thing from his life, God says no. Now, if that was you, how would you respond to that? I mean, what would you do? I'll tell you what a lot of us do. We start to drift. I mean, something bad happens and we blame God for it. It might be our fault, but we blame God, so we stop showing up. We stop praying. We stop reading our Bible. I mean, a lot of us go through life and we've got this idea that God owes us the answer that we want to our prayers. But Paul doesn't do that. And instead of getting angry, he says he's going to delight in those things that hurt. He's going to delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships. Not because they're fun, but because he knows that those things bring him closer to God. See, for Paul, the goal of his life was not an easy life. He didn't have an easy life that he was praying would get easier. His goal was to be closer to Jesus. So if these hard things were a part of that growth process, he was willing to accept that and worship in spite of all the difficulties. And that brings me to the fourth thing. When a comeback seems impossible, you endure patiently, you pray fervently, you worship passionately, and then you share freely. Earlier this week, I was in a prolonged meeting with a couple of guys, and over the course of a few hours, there were some lulls in the conversation. You know how that goes. We were going back and forth over an issue, and a little intense at times, but we had these lulls. And during one of those lulls, one of those guys looked down at my arm that was on the desk there. And years ago, I broke my wrist, and I have a nasty scar that goes down the inside my wrist. They did surgery in the plates and screws and all that. So the guy looks down, and he sees this scar on my arm, and he says to me, do you mind if I ask how you got that scar on your arm? You know what I did? I immediately rolled my sleeve down. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have a scar on my arm. Well, you're seeing things. I've got the most perfect arm that you've ever seen. I've seen a lot of arms. There's nobody that's got an arm that's more perfect than mine. No, I didn't say that. You think, what's wrong with this guy? I told him the story of how I had the scar on my arm. Have you ever noticed, though, that sometimes we try to hide our scars? We try to pretend like they're not there, that there's nothing bothering us, that we've got it all together, that our lives are great. And because of that, I think we miss out on some incredible opportunities. Because here's the deal. Nobody can relate to somebody that's perfect. But we can all relate to people that have scars because we've all got scars. There's a phrase we use. You'll sometimes hear that we say this: the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. Now, if you visited a museum, You know everything in a museum's in pristine condition. You walk in, you walk up to an exhibit, the lighting's perfect, the works of art are priceless, everything looks great, everything's clean and wonderful, and it's neatly put together and displayed. It's just awesome. But if you go to a hospital, it's not like that. You go to a hospital, sometimes it gets a little bit messy. And rather than seeing all these incredible works of art, you go to a hospital, what do you see? You see people who are struggling, and you see stuff that sometimes can get pretty ugly. But here's the cool part. In a hospital, you see people who are struggling to get better. And when you talk about your scars, when you talk about your issues, when you embrace the weaknesses of your own heart, you come to a point where it's easier to talk about those things because you're not talking about your power, you're talking about God's power. Paul came to a point where he realized that his circumstances were not likely to change. And he discovered something that goes against everything we think we know about life. And it's this. He says it like this at the end of verse 10. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Now in our world, we think that strength leads to strength. But from God's perspective, it's weakness that leads to strength. So I was reading about these movies, and this past week I kind of got obsessed with the world of screenwriting. And I came across a book titled The 7 Basic Plots. It was written by an English journalist named Christopher Booker. And in the book, he makes the claim that every movie, every story that's ever been written follows one of 7 basic plots. Doesn't matter if you're talking about Shakespeare's plays or Toy Story 4 or Downton Abbey or whatever. There are 7 basic plots. He identifies them as this: overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, rebirth, comedy, and tragedy. I was reading about this, and the one that caught my attention was this idea of rebirth. And in the chapter on that, he describes this moment as the enlightenment and transformation of a character. In other words, in a rebirth story, there comes a moment where the main character has to make a decision, and the decision is so profound, and the implications of that decision are so life-changing that it can only be described as a rebirth. So I was thinking about this, and it occurred to me that throughout our lives, you and I have the opportunity to experience multiple rebirth scenarios. The day you become a Christian, the Bible says you're born again. The day you discover your calling is a day that could be described as a rebirth. You're going this way, and God redirects your life, and you go a different direction. But there's another rebirth scenario that you see in this story that's just as important as the first two. When you come to a place in your life where you realize that you can either move forward in your own strength, or you can choose to admit your weakness and move forward in the power of God, everything changes. When you try to do it your way, try to do it your own strength, it usually doesn't work out too good. When you try to do it in His strength by admitting your weakness, it changes everything. I want you to stand. A few years ago, a few years after Paul wrote this letter that we know as 2 Corinthians, he wrote another letter to a church that was meeting in the city of Philippi. And as he wrote this letter, he was chained up inside of a Roman prison cell. He was waiting to see whether or not he was going to live or die. And towards the end of that letter, he makes an incredible statement that I want to read to you. Listen close. Here's what he writes. He said, I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And you can add whether things are going great or whether it's a disaster, whether I'm in prison or whether I'm free. And then he gives you the secret. Now make sure you catch this part. He said, I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. Those are the words of a man who discovered that the key to life is not always a change in your circumstances. Oftentimes it's a change in your relationship with Jesus. Some of you here this morning, and you know what it's like to be tormented. You know what it's like to have that clenched fist waiting for you to get up every morning so it can beat you back down. And if that's your situation, I want you to know there is a path forward. And while the path may include a change in your circumstances, it may not. But whatever it is you're facing, the one promise I can make you is that His grace will be sufficient for you. And His power is made perfect in your weakness. But it only works if you're willing to admit your weakness. So we're going to have an invitation song, and if you need a fresh experience of His sustaining grace, we want to help you. I'll be here. Some of our elders are here. If you need to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, you want to help navigate, we'll help you navigate whatever it is you need to do. Some of you may want to join. Had a family join first service. If you join the church, I'm just telling you, this is not a museum. This is a place for people that are really messed up. And I'm at the front of the line on that. But if you want to be a part of a place of messed up people where people are trying to get better, we'd love to have you. Whatever you need to do, just meet me here on the